If you ask most people about in genetics or inheritance, and ask them to name a person that had work that influenced understanding of inheritance, the name that probably many people could remember from their high school biology would be Gregor Mendel. And Mendel is remembered for his work on inheritance in pea plants. And it's important to understand that Mendel was more than just a guy who bred pea plants. Mendel has a very interesting academic background. And for those of you who might struggle academically, Gregor Mendel was a very intelligent student, but when it came time to take his qualifying examinations to become a teacher, he had what appears to be panic attacks and was unsuccessful at passing those exams. And so Mendel entered into a monastery and did what, in this particular monastery he was in, the members were committed to furthering the understanding of nature by pursuing experimentation. And Mendel became involved in understanding the biology of plants and the passing of characteristics from one generation to the next. Now, what makes Mendel's work even more impressive, it was done in the mid 1800s, and at that point, DNA was not known about. There was no knowledge of meiosis, there was no knowledge of chromosomes, there was no knowledge of alleles, and Mendel did all of his work in the absence of that knowledge. So we might look back at it and go, oh yeah, 3-to-1 ratio, Mendel's pea plants. But you have to place yourself in his position, which is his was the first organized recorded attempt to understand what was causing or what was the process of inheritance or passing of characteristics from one generation to the next. It's also important to mention that Mendel tried working with other plants that did not demonstrate simple modes or other traits in different plants that did not demonstrate these what are called Mendelian or simple modes of inheritance. And so his life was not characterized by success in every organism he worked with. Mendel published his work in the mid or 1860s. However, his work went largely unnoticed. And you have to remember, of course, there was no internet. We're not streaming articles around the world at one time. So it's largely thought that people didn't understand the significance of his work. In the early 1900s, three scientists are said to have independently rediscovered Mendel's work. In other words, approximately 40 years after it was published, people began to understand more of the significance of what Mendel had discovered in terms of his patterns of inheritance. And so that's why Mendel is sometimes referred to as the father of genetics. He's given credit for figuring out what's happening in terms of movement of traits through a particular population of plants. And so here are the traits that Mendel looked at: the seed color of his peas, the shape, the coat color, the pod shape, the plant height, and the flower position. So these are the traits, and the traits had phenotypes, or different physical expressions of themselves. Now, there were said to be the dominant form and the recessive form, and we've talked about how a dominant allele masks the expression of a recessive allele. So through his breeding, he showed yellow was dominant to green, brown was dominant to wrinkled, and so on. So we're going to look at some of Mendel's characteristics within the context of understanding his two laws of inheritance. The first being the law of segregation, and the second being the law of independent assortment.